What does government need to do?
Look, I think it's really tough, and these are long-term issues. So the real issue is more education. The real issue is to try and adjust arrangements within markets to improve competition. I think we understand all the things that need to be done to improve productivity. But as you say, these are long-term strategic policies, and the problem with Australia is that we have a 3-year election cycle. So a government can do a bit in the first year, and in the second year they're starting to look towards getting re-elected. So anything that is going to be unpopular, it's very, very hard for a government to deal with that. And then of course we think about how fiscal policy responds to other forces that are going on in the economy. So Australia's had this huge lift in our terms of trade. It's generated much better fiscal positions than we expected. And the pressure on fiscal policy is to use that to deal with some of the cost of living issues, which of course creates the issue around boosting demand and making the inflation problem even more difficult. So that's a really big challenge for government to withstand those pressures.
What do you think of the RBA's strategy over the last couple of years?
Look, I thought their policies in the early stages of COVID were absolutely spot on. In particular, they didn't go down the route of the other central banks of doing quantitative easing, which we realise is a pretty blunt instrument. We're not sure whether it benefits at all. It ends up with a bloated Reserve Bank balance sheet. We saw that some months ago we calculated that the mark to market of their balance sheet was a loss of about 60 billion because they bought the bonds. But in the initial stages they didn't do that. They used other policies that were more effective. So I thought they were absolutely doing the right thing. But then at the end of 2020 they fell into line with other central banks and went down the quantitative easing route, and also extended a lot of these policies out to 2024, these big stimulus, the term funding facility and the yield curve control facility. They extended them at a time when it was becoming clearer that the signals around vaccines, etc., were saying that the world isn't facing a total disaster. So I think that second set of policies at the end of 2020 was where they overreached. But in retrospect, it's easy enough to say it. At the time, we were thinking, well, the risk is that if they don't do that, the Aussie dollar will rise too much, and they'll need to be, and it'll become even more difficult for them to achieve their inflation targets. So, in retrospect, certainly, but I think they've come under a lot of criticism, a lot of which is very, very harsh.
Too harsh?
Well, I think that if we think about the point I made about where did the inflation come from, not from their policies, and who's responsible for bringing the inflation down, they are. And that's the right role, but it makes them the unpopular people in the public domain, whereas indeed they're mopping up a problem, an issue that came from a different arm of the policy of debate.
No one's really made that point, Bill, that government created stimulus and the RBA has had to get it under control.
Yeah.
That's essentially what's happened here.
And that's not just the RBA, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, all of these central banks have been dealing with an inflation issue that was obviously partly driven by a supply side, but also driven by excessive stimulus coming from fiscal policy.
The polite Philip Lowe has not pointed that out to a government, to this government, and I can understand why. It looks like his term isn't going to be extended. Politics is one thing. Do you think that's the right decision? And do we really think that the next person's going to take a dramatically different path?
Look, we don't know, Laura. We really don't know if Phil does not get reappointed. We don't know exactly what the new approach will be. We hope that it will continue to be containing inflation, because we know if inflation gets away from you, the cost of restoring it is much greater. My concern about the changes that we're seeing is more about the structure of the board, where we have only 2 internals and 7 externals. So in other central banks, the board has a majority of internals. So the central bank that is charged with achieving the inflation target really has the power to do that, whereas in a board where you only have 2 internals, 7 externals, it's going to be much more difficult to implement the policies that you think are right when you have to convince 7 others who are all being appointed on the basis of their monetary policy expertise.
So you think that's a mistake?
I think I would rather see a balance where the internals have the majority, which is what we've seen in the UK, New Zealand, Canada, US.
Who's the best treasurer or leadership team in politics that you've worked with?
Oh, look, I think Hawke Keating and Howard Costello were both great teams. They both were there during prosperous times for Australia. They both were together for a long time, which proved that the electorate supported them, and the results were there for everyone to see. So certainly we had those 2 great periods where we had stability and reform. Howard and Costello introduced the GST. Yeah. What an incredible political decision that was, to try and go to an election telling the people that if you vote for us, your taxes will go up. It doesn't often happen, and yet they did that. They had the courage to do it, and they pulled it off. Yeah. And Hawke and Keating, during the deep recession of the 90s, they cut tariffs. That was an incredibly courageous decision. So they've been successful because they've been politically courageous as well.
What's happened since then to politics, do you think? Because it hasn't happened since. You know, I cannot imagine in this day and age any political party, any Prime Minister going to an election promising to raise taxes. Can you?
It'd be difficult, and because everyone understands that reform of the GST is important, we need to increase it. We need to broaden it. That can take pressure off direct taxes. Can't even have a
conversation about that now, Bill.
And now it's just too hard, and that's a great shame.
The outgoing Westpac Chief Economist Bill Evans sat down with him yesterday. It certainly was a history lesson, but also a lesson there for our current crop of politicians to perhaps take heed of. And this is all very timely, of course, because we are standing by for that announcement now in about 10 minutes' time for a new RBA governor. It is not going to be Philip Lowe. His term not extended beyond September, and we'll get a new governor that announced very shortly by the Prime Minister and Treasurer.